coming here tonight. I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to round of applause for Erin and Jason. To take the time out of doing stuff to come here and talk to us about storage best practices. Just the time to prepare these presentations and learn them. It's just to me, that's a very much appreciated. Jason and Erin are both V specialists for EMC, and they came here today to talk about storage best practices, not EMC best practices, not NetApp best practices, but storage best practices. This product was developed by Chad Stakat
and Von Stewart.
And they did a great job. It was a great presentation at VMworld, and they came here to share it with you guys. So enjoy, and we'll see you after.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
My screen went black. I don't, can't figure it. This is for a different recording. It's just not going to record.
Just push that red button.
Yeah, the screen is blank.
Battery die?
You don't need any timed out. On/off button on the side.
Yeah, you gotta watch it, buddy. Okay. Okay. We're going to assume that's recording.
Okay,
so
cool.
My name is Erin Banks. I'm a V specialist from EMC. I actually support the federal organizations. It's actually just in DC yesterday. It's absolutely beautiful down there. I highly recommend it. And this is Jason Marques.
Yep, I'm Jason Marques. I'm also a V specialist with EMC, pretty much covering the New England area for a lot of our mid-market customers.
Can you guys hear him?
I can speak louder, though.
Is that on your microphone?
Yeah, I don't think it's connected to this, though. I got a separate one.
I'm louder, so I can definitely shout if you guys want to swap if you're having a hard time hearing him in the back. So as Chris had indicated, so we're here to talk about the vSphere 5 best practices. Now, did anyone here go to VMworld 2012 in San Francisco? Okay, a couple. You would have seen that Chad and Vaughn did this presentation. Now, we've made some changes a little bit because this is Chad and Vaughn's presentation, but today we're speaking as Erin and Jason. So as much as Chad and Vaughn, we think that they're great, and they're wonderful guys and very intelligent, we are also in the field and have our own comments. So if you have any comments that you want to throw back or any questions, feel free. This is a back and forth conversation. Actually, when it comes down to it, I absolutely hate the slides. So anything that you can do to just bring us to the forefront. There's other people here that can assist as well if you have some technical questions. I know we actually had one when we were walking up here.
Yep.
So our agenda for today is going to be a couple things. The first one we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the number one probably question that Jason and I get out in the field is the actual protocol debate. And I'll cover that. And then we're going to cover the 6 things that we think, what Chad and Vaughn thought, were the most important with regard to storage. What you need to know when you're actually making your decisions with regard to storage, and specifically with regard to vSphere 5. And we just want to stress that. We'll try to cover a couple points of where there's a differentiation between the vSphere 5 and the vSphere 4. But as you know, they made such dramatic changes going into vSphere 5 that it changes the entire landscape with regard to storage. So we'll cover those 6 aspects. And then lastly, we're just going to cover some capabilities of what we think are some problems that we tend to hear in the field, questions that Jason and I get, as well as some other V specialists as well, and understanding of what we feel are just some key points that you should recognize if you run into any problems. Of course, it's also great to just notice that we do have a booth down in the lower level, so if you have any questions afterwards, we'll be here. But we're going to be here all day because I understand there's beer served.
Yeah, watch you sit. Yeah,
there's nothing more important than beer served after the session. So I'll stay anywhere as long as beer will be there.
Mm-hmm.
So the great protocol debate. So this is an interesting kind of conversation, right, that comes up. It's always obviously the aspect of whether or not you want to do fiber channel, NFS, iSCSI, fiber channel over Ethernet. And the number one thing I'll always understand is that all of them can be highly available, but none of them are inherently highly available. So Jason's going to talk a lot about this in some further slides about what the difference is with regard to protocols and how we have one protocol become highly available because it doesn't inherently have that capability. But outside of that, it's also important to understand that every storage vendor uses the same storage protocols, but everyone implements them differently. So we can't stress enough about you having to do your due diligence with regard to your storage, with regard to understanding how that company works, how they actually implement these individual storage protocols that you're most comfortable with. Now, if we think about the fact of vSphere 5 and vSphere 4, we think about 3 reasons why it is that you want to implement storage, right? High availability, performance, and scalability. Right? So if we think about those 3 aspects, and we've already covered the high availability for the most part, and Jason will cover it more, if we think more about the scalability and performance, and we think about the changes that we've had in vSphere 5, specifically with regard to the MFX, right? So now we have the ability to create larger data stores. So in the beginning with vSphere 4, a lot of the data stores would be, customers would want to go to NFS because they would want to create the larger data stores. Now, we really feel that there's a level playing field along those lines. So when we still go back to that debate, we get it. I get it every week. It's a question. I have a call next week with the customer that says, should we be using NFS or fiber channel, file or block if we just want to simplify it, right? So if we go down to that aspect and we say, really the question then comes back to you. So what are you most comfortable with? Right? What do you have within your data center? What is the experience you have in your data center? Where are you growing? Right? What are your aspects in the sense of what are you going to be rolling out? Is it VDI? Are you going to be doing changing your applications? Are you going to be developing your own applications? All of these things are essential questions. Excuse me. All these things are essential questions that you need to ask yourself within your data center before you make that decision. Excuse me.
Coffee.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah, coffee. Love my coffee.
That's why I got it for you.
So it's always important, like I said, to just have those decisions within yours. Because again, with the vSphere 5, we're in that level playing field. It's also important to understand that you don't have to pick just one. You can have multiple. Now, it's also great from the aspect of understanding what are other people using. So Chad from EMC has a blog called Virtual Geek, and he did a poll on his website from the actual users and developers and everyone who uses the storage, and it says, okay, well, you guys decide what are your number one choice with regard to the storage protocols. And these are the statistics that he actually got. And as you can see, fiber channel or block is their number one choice, without a doubt. Now, in my opinion, I'm trying to be agnostic here, is the fact is, this is Chad's blog. He works for EMC. Sometimes people assume EMC's block, even though we are unified. But the fact is, sometimes people make that assumption, so maybe we can't always look at those. We have to look at them in a grain of salt. So then we bring up the fact of NetApp had actually done a poll as well. And their actual poll states that NFS was the number one decision, right? So not shocking, of course, from that aspect. So no matter what, I do, they'll say they work for EMC, but I'm one of those, I believe in the third party, right? I believe in a level playing field. I want to know the facts. I can go anywhere I want to go. Why do I make my decisions? I want to know what's actually occurring. So if you look at the third party, we'll look at Wikibon. And they actually did a study themselves. Absolutely nothing to do with any of these other companies. And this is actually the information that they found out. Now, what I think is most important that I wanted to state, because I hate this slide, I don't understand the numbers that they posted up here, and Jason and I got a huge discussion.
Don't want to get into a fight with Erin.
No, we got into a discussion. My dad said we don't argue, we discuss.
Yes.
So we got into a huge discussion about these numbers, and what I actually found out, I want to make sure that I get the numbers right, is what Wikibon has stated is that more, according to their website, okay, more than half, which is 59%, listed multiple protocols. Now, Fiber Channel was the number one of those multiple protocols, all right? And then outside of that, the people that chose a single protocol, 58% of them chose Fiber Channel for the single protocol. Okay, so facts, it's just what it is. It's what the user said. You have to assume, yes, take it with a grain of salt, look at that information. But if you have any questions, it's important to understand that, right? I also think it's important to understand that if this fact is out there, then you also have to understand what are the other technology companies developing within their own organizations as well, right? In the sense of, it's not just about the storage, right? It's about the whole data center. What are the communications? What are the technologies? What are the products that they're using? It's okay, so you don't have to crawl on the floor towards me. I appreciate that. So,
First thing in the mark.
okay.
There'd be vodka in that juice.
Beer afterwards. You can
Beer.
buy me a drink.
Yeah.
So, the fact that it's important to understand is the other technologies occurring, again, it's not just about the storage, right? It's the bigger playing field. It's the bigger arena. It's the other technologies. It's all the technologies that are out there at that table in the vendor booth, waiting to speak with you about their technology and what they've actually developed from their own capability, right? So things to think about across the board, because as I always will repeat the same comments over and over again, we're at a level playing field with regard to high availability, performance, and scalability with regard to vSphere 5. Okay. So what really comes down to it from the last aspect is, yes, the whole capabilities or the whole storage is really, again, your decision. What you're most comfortable with. We'll support whatever it is that you want to use, right? But when it becomes your decision, and also you don't have to make just one, right? I think a lot of times, I think what the studies have shown is that you can choose multiple protocols within your environment. I think that's actually best, but this is, Erin, thanks for this exact moment saying that, right? Don't lock yourself into one. It's not going to be beneficial from any particular standpoint. Does anyone have any questions about that? No. Do you guys, are any of you still having this debate within your own data center? Oh.
Show of hands?
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, if you don't have the backbone, if you don't have 10 gig in your data center, you're probably not looking at NFS, right?
Right.
That is definitely one of the common concerns we get. Yep.
That's what, that's all we can.
Right. I think it's interesting, and that's why I always, so it's great. We only have one hand raised, so I think that's interesting. I feel bad that I made all of you sit through 8 slides. It's something that you really didn't care about. But it is important to understand that from the aspect. And when I get that question, I find it interesting that they've asked me that question. First off, I'm a vendor, and they've asked me that question about what they think is most beneficial when it really comes down to what's already there.
The other thing is that, VMware in general has been poo-pooing iSCSI and NFS. Like, if you go back quite a few years, it's like, oh, we don't even support iSCSI for certain things. So that's all changed.
It is.
A little more speed. So
Yes. Again, it's perfect. It's a happy little plan, a little virtuous plan. Okay, great. Let's get to those 6 aspects, right? So the number one thing, which is my favorite, is documentation that's available from the individual vendors, right? The first one that's most important to understand is, what is VMware's documentation that they provide out to you? Now, when we were initially asked to do this presentation, my first document that I went to was just VMware's document about the storage differentiation. You can have this copy if you want it. Raise your hand. It's been a little worn. But the fact is, they've added that, right? So the documentation that they have covers that. As you can see, they even said the iSCSI configuration document, that they've implemented that, they've written it, they've added it to the website. Great, great information. If you're going to do anything from any aspect, from any virtual environment, you need to start with their website. Right? Read their documentation. It's essential. You make copies, leave them all over your house, leave them in the bathroom. It doesn't really matter, but read their documentation and understand what you need to do from your standpoint with regard to storage and with regard to protocols. Because they're going to let you know what's best practices. Whether or not you like to use the terminology best practices, the fact is they think this is what is best for you using this technology. Okay, great websites. As they've indicated, so the mandatory reading. Yes?
With regard to the NAS or NFS versus iSCSI, are you saying that VMware has actually changed their position about things like Exchange being on block storage versus NFS? Because I thought that most recently, things I've read have said it needs to be on block.
Well, as Erin had stated, when we start looking at, and the question was, has VMware's, opinion about certain applications being deployed over certain protocols, has that really changed essentially to be more protocol agnostic? Again, that's where you're going to be leveraging what those best practices are. At the core of everything, you're really going to, again, be able to provide the basic functionality of high availability, to be able to provide scalability and some performance. The question is whether or not it's a perfect match for the application itself. Well, that's going to come from Microsoft, and that's going to come from VMware as to what they would suggest. But the idea as just a hypervisor connectivity option, the goal here with VMware and the vSphere 5 release is to basically say, we can cover all of these basic essentials that may have lacked in earlier versions, that may have caused customers to choose one over the other. Right.
So it's always important when they make those changes, when they do those upgrades from a version perspective, from a code perspective, revisit their website, make sure that you understand huge changes occurred between 4.1 and 5, now 5.1. Huge changes. After you've gone to the VMware website and after you've reviewed their actual documentation, then you want to go to the individual vendors' documentation sites. I also think it's important to understand if you're going to commit to an actual vendor or a single vendor or multiple vendors, understand what their thoughts are from a technology perspective and what they're providing to you, right? How are they helping you with regard to documentation? because that's what you're counting on, right? When you run into problems, the first thing is, what does the documentation say, right? We have people here from support, and they're going to say, and I've been in support 7 years, what does the documentation say? What are the recommendations? That's what you want to do. That's what's going to help you first off. So what do these individual companies provide you with, right? There's, from an EMC perspective, we have our individual tech books. From a NetApp's perspective, they have technical reports. So make sure you go to these individual sites, again, check them out, understand what they say for the configuration standpoint, right? Specifically with regard to vSphere, specifically with regard to the other plugins or other capabilities that the company is providing. It's the larger understanding of the company as a whole and how they're going to actually function within your data center. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Thank you. So a quick show of hands, how many of you are kind of storage admins today or have experience, in storage administration for the most part? Okay. I just want to make sure that I don't get too much into the weeds for those of you that are kind of getting into it. Because we're going to start getting into some of the more technical conversation, primarily around multipathing. This is very, very important. And within vSphere 5, there has been some changes that VMware has made in the hypervisor layer, and actually started around vSphere 4 with the whole complete hypervisor rehaul. They pretty much have built, as we move along, a more pluggable architecture within VMware. You'll see a lot now with API integration, with third-party support, really the ability for the complete industry to embrace virtualization, embrace VMware, to really make it a piece of the environment, but yet not necessarily have customers build their environment around vSphere in the sense that I have to change what I do, I have to change the vendor I use because everything is proprietary and so forth. It's very open today. So in regards to multipathing, when we start having the protocol debate, it's very important to understand what changes have occurred in that sense. VMware has made multipathing to be more open with the introduction of a pluggable storage architecture. At the core of it, it essentially says that VMware has built into the hypervisor native multipathing capabilities, but we also have the ability to have third-party vendors design, create, and integrate their multipathing policies that may be a better fit when connecting to their own storage systems, that you can essentially choose as a customer which one you want to use, or maybe choose to use both side by side. So there's some flexibility there that exists. Right? Start talking about the architecture, we're really talking about high availability policies, but also policies in regards to performance, load balancing and so forth, and the like. So when first having the conversation, what comes in the box? Well, vSphere 5 today has these 3 different path selection policies. You typically would start out with a fixed policy, which essentially says that I'm using one storage path at a time to communicate to my back-end storage system. I have secondary paths available to me, but they're not going to be used until some sort of failure occurs, and then that's kind of my backup. We typically see this as the default path selection policy for active-active storage systems. How many are familiar with the concept of active-active storage? Perfect, okay. We typically see this as being more enterprise-grade systems where you have multiple controllers accessing the same storage on the back end, so there's kind of a sharing of the load there. Most recently used is the next policy that comes out of the box. This one is also another kind of single path at a time type of policy. In this case, again, I have a backup path and I won't use it until a failure occurs on my primary. Now, the difference here between fixed and most recently used is that once my original path comes back up, most recently used will continue to leverage that secondary path until that one fails, and then move back to what my primary used to be. Fixed will, if the primary path comes back up, will automatically pretty much change what path I'm using back to what that primary is, and maintain that secondary as a backup again. So there's kind of that ability to go back and forth in an automated way versus just staying on one at a time. Most recently used is actually the default that you typically would see with active-passive arrays. Active-passive arrays you find more in the mid-range storage systems, unified platforms. So in the EMC portfolio, the VNX would be considered an active-passive system. The NetApp, you'd have the FAS models. That would be more active-passive. In this case, you're dealing with 2 controller storage systems in which you have a LUN ownership model. So only one controller is servicing I/O for any given LUN at any given time. Even though both of them will be operating together, only one is going to be servicing I/O for any given LUN at any given time. And so based upon the idea of only failing back when that secondary path fails, works better with those types of systems. Round robin is VMware's next wave of trying to adapt an active-active storage path model. The ability to have multiple channels be used at the same time to talk to the same back-end storage. By default, VMware has a set policy to have 1,000 IOs go down one path, 1,000 IOs go down the other, and so forth in this type of fixed round-robin fashion. But this allows me now to better utilize the bandwidth across the available storage channels that I have connected to my storage system. Versus that single path at a time, I'm only bound by the bandwidth of that one link until something happens. At this point, if I have 2 links at 1 gig apiece, I could potentially use 2 gig worth of bandwidth as a whole, as an aggregate, to share all of my storage traffic. Okay. Now, there's been some updates with this industry standard technology we call asymmetric logical unit access, or ALUA for short. This pretty much is built to address the lack of the active-passive model that you find in mid-range, to treat those types of systems, or to make those types of systems look more like an active-active array. And at this point, I can start sharing multiple path storage traffic to either of the controllers for the same volume. Right? So in this particular example, you kind of see in the diagram, I'm not really looking at one processor taking in all of the I/O for a given LUN. Even though, let's say, this particular LUN is owned by storage processor B, I can still send data down to storage processor A to be serviced for that LUN. So now, again, I'm increasing the availability of the channels that I could use to send I/O for that one particular LUN. What happens in this case is that internally there's a communication channel between the storage processors. And so if I am receiving an I/O for a particular LUN that doesn't belong to me, I'll just hand that off to my peer internally, and then it will then process that I/O for me. The idea is that I'm still leveraging, again, all the channels that I possibly can. So this is very important because it really helps us increase storage bandwidth utilization. Right. Okay, so high availability is what Erin was getting at. Block-based protocols like iSCSI and Fiber Channel have the ability to maintain high availability if a physical link fails for the same session. And the reason is block protocols are typically initiator target. With iSCSI, you see that a lot when you set up the initiator and target and all that type of stuff. Fiber Channel, it's worldwide names and so forth. But in this case, native within the protocol itself, I have the ability to redirect traffic if there's some sort of failure in my infrastructure. So that's pretty important because it's the endpoints that manage that failure and that failback. Right? So when I think about how I want to implement block storage protocols, right, how do I deploy high availability in my infrastructure? Well, I definitely would recommend no single point of failure in the fabric, but I also want to make sure that I have no single point of failure at each of the endpoints as well. But typically going one off the other, one HBA channel to another switch and another HBA to switch 2 and so forth is typically good enough. Why is that important? Well, because if I have all these different connections from a high availability perspective, I can then start using added intelligence that doesn't necessarily come built into vSphere from a multipathing policy. And this is where third-party vendors come in to help. Specifically, vendors like EMC and our PowerPath Virtual Edition software, as well as Dell EqualLogic, and they have a multipathing policy they've incorporated. This essentially runs on the hypervisor itself. And instead of in the round robin fashion where I have all of these different active paths and I have a fixed 1,000 IOs here, 1,000 IOs there, I'll admit it's kind of stupid. If that 1,000 IOs is due to be sent down any path and that path is already busy, I'm still going to try to push it through. That may not necessarily be the best to get me the optimal performance that I'd need. So we want some added intelligence that is built on top. PowerPath Virtual Edition and these kind of types of products are used to kind of add that intelligence. So I'm, for every single I/O, able to determine, oh, this path's already busy. So I'm going to send this I/O down this other channel that is available to me and do so that now I have an aggregate of this big pipe that all of my virtual machines can use. And from a management and administration perspective, you get out of the work of doing all the plumbing. So no longer do I have to specifically choose a policy for each virtual machine as what my default is. These particular software products do that for me, and it will all just kind of be plugged in and automated. So the failover, the failback, the load balancing, all of those types of properties get automated within the software so that you don't have to worry about it. Okay? So this is very important. If possible, to gain the most optimal bandwidth, especially once you start hyper-consolidating virtual machines on each of your physical hosts, the CPU and memory resources on those hosts tend to not necessarily be the bottleneck, although we can say we never have enough memory, right? It's really the network that becomes your next kind of problem. This helps alleviate that. Okay. So talking about block and how everything has native high availability built into it at each of the endpoints, this is where NFS and leveraging version 3 needs some consideration. Okay? Natively, NFS version 3 is not a multipathing or parallel access protocol. It is a single session through a single connection type of protocol. So if I lose a link, I then lose the session. So the problem is, how do I build high availability into that? Well, for customers that are deploying NFS, in order to do that, you need to build high availability into your network. So the burden is on essentially the network itself to maintain uptime. There are technologies available out there from your different switch vendors, from the EMC side or NetApp side, from the array, but also at the VMware side to provide that level of redundancy in your network to kind of, again, give you that high availability. So first and foremost, it would be a best practice to leverage NIC teaming on the host side, and then hopefully leverage 2 different network switches. And depending on the type of switch you have, you might have the ability to create this type of cross-stack connection. In which case, from a switch administration perspective, it looks like one big switch, even though it's 2 switches that are connected together. That's what they call a stacked switch. So at this point, I'm protecting against a switch failure. Right? From a storage array perspective, I can create that same type of NIC teaming or port aggregation so that if any individual port on the array side fails, I can still maintain that logical connection. So you want to be able to maintain this high availability throughout your network. There are guides that are out there that kind of describe how you'd want to set this up, which particular switch vendors support what. So in this case, you see something like Ether channel. That's only supported from Cisco, and there are a certain finite number of links that you can combine. There's LACP, which is typically more industry standard for those types of things. So you definitely want to take that into consideration if NFS is part of your deployment plan. Okay. General best practices around NFS, and the gentleman had brought up a great point. Typically, because it is a single session for each connection, you want to make sure that the bandwidth on that single connection is good enough to handle all my traffic, because I'm not sharing the load across multiple channels. So in this case, when leveraging GigE, it could potentially pose more of an administration burden, because now I'm trying to pinpoint which specific links I want to send my traffic over and manually load balance it myself. At this point, you might want to start looking at 10 gig, in which case now I have a bigger pipe to just draw most of my traffic down at that point. All right. There are plugins, great point here. Regardless of the vendor, EMC or NetApp or Compellent or Equalogic, whoever it is. Almost all the vendors nowadays have VSI plugins, right? That helps allow us to configure the storage under the covers. And based upon the vendor that you have, they're already building in the best practices as to what they need to configure on the back end to be optimal for that particular type of protocol setup. So leverage those as best you can so that it takes the guesswork out of your hands, because it's all fully automated for you by leveraging a nice simple GUI. And for those who are the VMware administrators out here, it's all in your native vCenter context, so nothing really changes. The last piece that I want to talk about is in regards to NFS. We are still using version 3 in vSphere, but VMware has changed a little bit as far as creating NFS data stores by allowing us to use the host name versus the actual IP address. And what this allows us to do is almost create this virtual address space on the back-end storage system that allows me to create multiple connections in kind of a round-robin fashion across multiple mount points on each of my controllers in a cluster. We see more of this in the EMC Isilon or scale-out storage systems, where each particular controller has access to the same NFS mount. So if I can create this kind of spider web of NFS connections across all of them, I'll easily be able to load balance all of those NFS sessions across multiple controllers, bettering the performance as a whole. Okay. This is a quick and easy one. Jumbo frames, we get this asked a lot. Don't even bother with them. The overhead involved in managing it and setting it up, and the risk that you have where one particular component in the stack is not configured the same way, you're going to give yourselves more headaches than what the actual performance benefit would be. At least in the NFS case and iSCSI here too. The important thing to understand, if we are leveraging both iSCSI and NFS from a VMware and hypervisor communication perspective, best practice, use different subnets for stored traffic. That way you're not bumping in one or the other. Okay. Alignment, the next piece. Alignment is very important. This is probably the under the hood problem that most customers run into. It's kind of that unforeseen problem that you get if you don't pay attention to it up front, and as you scale, it actually poses much more of a problem later on. This all has to do with file system alignment, not only in the guest of all of your virtual machines, Windows 2003, Windows XP, all of those types of OS versions encounter this problem. But if you run into a situation where your alignment of your file systems throughout the stack is off, then you're going to cause more I/O to happen than really what needs to be, because each of those chunks that gets written to the back-end storage system would need to be written to twice. Some performance in back-end information to illustrate this point, that as you scale out, you may not realize it up front, but as you do scale, it does become a problem. So definitely check the documentation from the guest OS vendors on how you would actually fix the alignment issue. As we see here, there are guest tools like DiskPart in Windows for Windows 2003 and below. And there are some Linux versions out there that encounter the same issue too. So just to be aware of that. Windows 2008, Vista, and Windows 7 natively have fixed this. So they have this 1 meg offset already that exists in their master boot record. So you don't have to worry about it. That's all taken care of. So typically it's more a legacy OS issue to keep in mind. From a VMFS data store perspective, the best practice to fix it is to just destroy the data store and recreate it back, and everything should be aligned accordingly.
Jason, how do you detect before you can?
So there are some tools here. Uber Align will be able to, it's a free downloaded tool, and there's also some tools from NetApp called the Migrate and Optimize that you can kind of scan and see how it is. And the idea here is it will be able to align those for you. I think we don't have the website on here, but you should be able to leverage those types of tools to kind of check it out, but also to fix it.
Thanks.
Sure. Right. Thanks, Erin.
You're welcome, Jason. So we're just going to cover number 4, which is aspect of the plugin. So it's my favorite section. think it's also important that I cover it because this kept reiterating over and over again, it's important to understand what your vendors are using. So if we think about what VMware has done with regard to their API and allowing other vendors to come in and write specifically to VMware, right? And allowing you to see the different aspects. So if you look at the top and we look at that's referenced, the dark blue is referenced as VMware, the lower area is referenced as the actual storage arrays. We look at the top three, not the top most important, Jason, another discussion Jason and I got into, but one of the top three kind of areas with regard to the plugins that VMware has developed or allow the vendors to actually develop. This is actually more specific with regard to EMC, so I do apologize for this. This is our slide, but it's a great understanding of where it is, what VMware has done, and give you a broader picture of everything. So if you look at the first one, it was just the vCenter plugins. This was established back in 4.1. It seems so long ago, like 40 seconds ago, right? So that was our VSI plugin from an EMC perspective. But this was a plugin that really broke down the whole idea of breaking down the barriers, right? So the whole comments that we always make with regard to virtualization is that it's changed the data center completely, right? It allows the storage side and the VMware side to kind of communicate and break down the silos. It's no longer knocking on one door and saying, hey, can you give me some storage? It's really being able to say, hey, give me some storage, and now don't come talking to me anymore, right? So as much as we want to break down those silos, it's open up those communications from some organizations. I understand that some don't, especially in the federal world. Everyone loves their silos. But the ability is there from an actual VMware side to see what your storage is, your underlying storage is. It's for you to understand specifically where your virtual machines are, on what type of storage, what that configuration is, and gives you better insight from a virtualization standpoint. Now, if we look at the bottom part, it actually then goes on the other side, where from a storage standpoint, you can actually understand what's occurring with your virtual machines. So if I'm a storage administrator and all of a sudden I want to make some changes to my organization, my data center, or it's that weekend and I've got nothing else to do, play with my storage, then I want to actually know what kind of impact I'm going to have. So therefore, if I had direct understanding of those virtual machines on my storage, great capabilities, right? Again, different data center, different world, great technology, great capabilities that VMware has allowed to happen. Lastly was that multi-pathing aspect that Jason just talked about. Obviously incredibly, incredibly important from any standpoint, but I won't go into that because Jason reviewed that. So the vStorage API for data protection, I'm originally a security girl, so this is incredibly important to me. Sliding down the back one here. Very cute. Sorry about that. So the VADP gives you the ability for backup, right? Natively within the actual applications, which is huge, right? You can't talk about protocols, you can't talk about virtualization, you can't talk about anything without actually also having a discussion about backup. You shouldn't be ignoring that. It's incredibly, incredibly important. I'm amazed at how many people actually don't touch upon that. But if you can easily develop it within your data center, if you can easily work it, if you can easily have a visual kind of understanding of what's occurring, what's being backed up, wouldn't you want that? So by having the ability to write directly to it, understand it, have a visual aspect, great capabilities, and again, different aspects. VMware did make a huge announcement about 5.1 initially, and some changes that they made with regard to that actual plugin. So I won't blow that myself. Lastly, the SRM capability. So again, understanding, are your storage vendors actually utilizing this, right? What are they doing? What are their thought process, right? It's important to understand if you're going to pick something, this is your storage, it's not going to be there and gone the next day. This is like your relationship, right? You have to have a relationship with your storage vendors and understand that this is also going to be long term. So what are they thinking? What are they implementing? What are they doing with regard to Site Recovery Manager? And are they writing directly to that API? We have VAAI from both a block and a file perspective. So this is really great.
That's my favorite.
This is actually Jason's favorite plugin. We actually have like our own favorite one. So this is his favorite, but really, really great capabilities because when you think about it, the storage is the workhorse within the data center, right? I mean, it's been around longer than actually VMware has from that perspective, right? So when you think about it and understand where we've grown with regard to storage, what it can do, what's its daily task, why wouldn't you have the storage do a lot of the work that's actually being done from a virtual standpoint and not create that extra overhead? If you can make those commands, bring that down to the storage level, have it work more efficiently, have it create a better performance within your data center, wouldn't you want to utilize that? So is your storage vendor actually utilizing those VAI capabilities inherently, both on the file and on the block side.
Awesome.
Oh, awesome, thank you. So Jason has a great demo, developed this. There's actually a link on the last page, and he'll plug it all that he wants because he worked really, really hard on it. It's really great. But this, again, from a security perspective, is always important because it allows you to develop policies specifically with regard to your storage. And everybody should be developing policies, right? So when you're trying to develop an SLA within your data center, you need policies. And in order to create policies, you need to know what the underlying storage infrastructure is. So you can't do one without the other. This is really great in the aspect of it's constantly changing, right? The last iteration that we had of VASA was completely different than the iteration that we have now, and will change from each one. So this is what I'm always saying, it's very important to go back to those websites, understand what your storage vendor has actually done with regard to these plugins and how they're functioning from that perspective. And lastly is the vCenter Operations connector. So this is something that actually is semi-new from the standpoint. But again, allowing, if everyone's familiar with vCenter Operations, obviously gives you the ability to look at performance with regard to virtual machines. So if you're in one dashboard, why wouldn't you want to look at the actual performance with regard to your underlying storage from that same capability? Why wouldn't you want those on both ends, right? Again, the whole idea is breaking down those silos, giving you visibility, understanding exactly what's occurring in your data center. So if you have that connector and you can see that with one screenshot, even better for you as the end user. Some additional stuff that came up with regard to VAI as well, specifically within the vSphere 5, is just the change that they have in the sparse VMDK format. So really great information to understand where you can have that, reclaim all the information, not reclaim the information, but actually reclaim the actual storage. Really great functionality that they added. Make sure that you're aware of all the changes that they've added specifically within the vSphere 5, if that's something you're going to. Most of my customers have actually not gone to vSphere 5, so it's really great that you guys are actually here and able to hear some of those updates specifically from that. Who here is actually running vSphere 5 within your data center? Oh wow, that's great. Okay. Is it, on average, is it 5.1? Is anyone running 5.1?
Labs don't count. Labs don't count. Cheater.
Okay. So just because we're running out of time, we're just going to go through this quickly. The last thing to note about those vCenter plugins is now that we've gone on the 5 capability, or specifically 5.1, they've changed those plugins to work with Flex. Now the main thing to focus on that is that because they've made that change, it's important for you to understand that all of these things are now going to be in your actual web client. VMware is pushing the web client. If you didn't already know that, you need to understand that now. Now the changes in 5.1. Get familiar with it, because they're gonna start making all the changes in that, and they're not going to work on the end user client capability. So just the number one thing that we wanted to state from that perspective. So keep it simple. My favorite thing, always love to keep it simple. When it comes down to it, this is just one screenshot. If you need any screenshot, if you want to take any pictures, this is probably the one to take from the perspective of what do we think is the actual kind of like best practices for the most part with regard to the storage, right? So just some various things, just because, and this is a discussion that Jason and I had the other day, is just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it, right? So just because you can create an incredibly large data store doesn't mean that you have to go that capability. Think it through, understanding, take your pictures.
Question?
If you're avoiding extents, 5 and 5.1, how large of a LUN can you present in order to make data store?
So the LUN size will vary based upon the storage vendor. So I think as of right now, you can create a LUN to be fairly large. The issue is whether or not on the back end you're concatenating volumes to make it look bigger to what you're presenting.
It has a 2T limit in terms of LUNs you can see. It's now got limited storage, whatever the limited storage system is.
I'm sorry, what was that question?
So 5 doesn't have a 2T limit anymore
Correct.
in terms of the LUNs that it can see. It's just whatever the storage platform.
Yeah, ultimately, as Erin could state, but with the vSphere 5 release and the VMFS 5 file system version, you can now support up to a 64 terabyte data store. The NFS is still set to 16 terabytes from a file system perspective, but that's where we start talking about the level playing field, because now size and scalability of a data store, you're pretty much getting the same thing regardless of the protocol. But yes, you are kind of more I mean, unless you think you're going to create something larger than 64 terabytes, but that tends to not be an issue anymore.
Actually, how many VMs per data store would you recommend?
Well, that's all going to be dependent upon what kind of ratio you can get. We see customers that do 30, 40 VM servers on a particular data store, and obviously the VAI capabilities allow customers to do that, specifically when connecting via block protocol, because there's no unlocking problem anymore that may have occurred in the previous 4 to 4.1 version, which is where these VAI commands were initially released. So at that point, you would always see a best practices guide to say don't put data stores more than 300 to 500 gig in size, because everybody's main tendency, it's human nature, I want to fill it up as much as I can, get the best value out of it. So at that point, though, as you scale more and more VMs onto a particular data store, you potentially have the risk of performance contention. And that's no longer the case here. So we've seen ratios go up, but again, it all really depends on the performance of what your virtual machines are doing, how big does each one need to be. So if you have a bunch of test dev kind of VMs out there, you can potentially increase it to 50 virtual machines per data store and so forth. It's a matter of what your requirements and sizings are.
You have avoid RDMs up there, which I love because I hate RDMs.
Me too.
So I just in reading documentation, I thought it was still a recommendation for if you were building a cluster or Exchange or SQL or what have you.
So what you're describing is right on point. Now we say avoid RDMs if you can. We want it to be VMDK policy first. If there are scenarios where certain applications require them as a best practice, then that's where you'd want to use it. The main point is to make it the exception to the rule versus the rule, to ease the administration of the entire environment. So now I don't have as many of these one-offs. But I know Exchange is still one of those applications that may still require it. SQL, they do now support it within a VMDK. I'm guessing that's going to be based on version. But again, you want to get to that documentation for those vendors to be sure.
So we're going to have to make just a change to the agenda. We only have like one section left, but we're already run over in time, and I'm just going to give Jason the ability to do this. We're not going to go over those last aspects of what changes need to occur or what problems you've actually seen. We've seen what the recommendations. Have the slide deck. We're going to be here all day, so if you want to discuss it, please feel free to come down to our booth. But again, we're like way over, and I'm so sorry.
So the last piece we're going to discuss are two features that were introduced with vSphere 5, storage DRS, SDRS, and storage I/O control. We'll touch upon this briefly, but storage I/O control is an excellent feature. We highly recommend using it if you can. Depending on the type of vSphere version that you've purchased from a licensing perspective, this feature would be made available to you. The idea behind it is to help avoid the noisy neighbor syndrome, where you have one VM that's pretty much hogging up all of the storage bandwidth and all of that resource, where you want to kind of force a balance. Think of it just like the network throttling, except for your storage environment, right? So definitely utilize that. There are some best practices as far as the vendor out there as to some of the threshold latencies that you'd want to set for when you want to start halting and pushing back when that noisy neighbor is going to start being throttled. So just definitely take a look at some of these information documentations for each of the vendors. The last piece is storage DRS. Are you guys familiar with storage DRS? A few? All right, cool. Think of this as being DRS for storage in the sense that, with regular DRS, you're moving virtual machines with vMotion in an automated way between physical hosts, depending upon the host resource utilization and thresholds that you can set. In this case, what we're going to do is create a cluster of data stores versus a cluster of physical servers that will allow, based upon these thresholds, like latency, as well as data store capacity utilization, whether or not a storage vMotion of that VM to another data store should be kicked off and automated so that I can balance out the data store utilization across my cluster. We typically find as a best practice here, specifically around EMC arrays that support auto tiering, The auto tiering is done at a sub-LUN level. The storage DRS is done at a data store level. So with that, added granularity, we find that we can better balance from a performance perspective the blocks of information that make up your data store across the tiers of drives. So we actually recommend you turn off the latency threshold as a metric that VMware uses to determine when to move a virtual machine. Instead, we say that you should just leverage the capacity. So one of those little best practice notes to keep in mind when leveraging this feature. Okay? The last thing to discuss about it is that storage DRS is not supported with all vSphere functionality. So it's important to understand where it may fit in your environment. So for example, things like VMware linked clones would not be a good candidate for a storage DRS cluster, but you can leverage things like array-based replication and so forth. But little things to keep in mind when looking at using storage DRS with things like Site Recovery Manager and whether or not those data stores are being replicated from a DR perspective. It is supported, but you may encounter some things like increased bandwidth because now that new LUN that VM got migrated to would need to replicate that new information to the target area. So some little backdoor things to just keep in mind if you're planning on using this. And that should be all we have.
So again, thanks everyone for coming to the actual session today. But again, Jason and I will be down at our booth if you have any.
Yep. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.